people who are into combat as long as they are playing it.
Mm-hmm.
If they're playing a different deck, it would feel completely not as enjoyable.
But then they blame it on I don't have combat.
Yeah, sure. This is called Stockholm.
So I think today the plan here is to talk about like what it is about this game that feels complicated. And one of those things is clearly what Jan and I were talking about a little bit before we started this, which is kind of how combat is layered. The whole 7-step process, the way that there are pre-steps in addition to the regular steps, the way that cards within combat tend to be worded kind of unusually, and I think there's a lot more to talk about related to that. But I think Jan had one of Jan's friends had a really good point on this, right? You found the statement that he had?
Yeah, exactly. He said, when I was trying to teach him Vitas, a Vitas is for him not necessarily complex, but rather elaborate. So the elaborateness is just like a layer which couldn't or didn't want to get to actually complex stuff.
Yeah, I would say that overall, like, that is a statement that I agree with a lot. From the time I started playing this game, and I've been playing it for basically 20, 25, a long time, feels like forever. The game has had this thing where, like, combat always felt kind of like an ordeal. A lot of times people, if you're listening to me in a game, I'll do this thing where I'll stop and I'll start being the narrator for combat, right? It'll be, okay, anything before strikes, and I'll try to remember who's the active person and go, like, just through the chain. Because to me, combat has always been this thing where it's very easy to screw up a step. It's very easy to screw up on card timings. And there's another layer they keep adding these, like, weird layers to the combat chain. And it's been very complicated historically with lots of renditions that have made it worse. 7 steps is better than it was before. 7 steps is not, I think, the most optimal way we can. And it sounds like you kind of agree from our conversation earlier.
Yeah, well, I feel like 7 steps do have listed every step a card can play that I encountered yet. But then again, there's the question, for example, which I said earlier as well. Why couldn't Carrion Rose not be played in the strike with, like, why is it not, it could be worded like strike, 2 environmental damage, and you get strike. So would have environmental, and it could be played in the same way.
So my response to that is still the same. Like, I think the card is better suited as a card that is something that the player on the opposite end can know about ahead of time. So it doesn't make sense to me to make it a strike per se, but to me, the need for it to be in its own separate step just is confusing. Like, I would think the card would be better used in the maneuvers phase. You play it as part of the natural maneuver process. One player plays their cards, another player plays their cards, etc., etc., etc. And you kind of don't need an extra step for these extra playing of these cards. Or you need to call that step something other than pre-range, because pre-range is terrible wording for it anyway. The one that I liked the most, though, that you talked about shifting positions was Immortal Grapple. Go ahead. What was your position on it?
Yeah, like, I think this could be, for example, a strike as well. Like, it could say a hand strike, or you get one additional strike, and the other player gets a hand strike as well if he had children or something. So maybe something in that way. Here it's about strikes and not about extra separate window. Feels somewhat unnatural, not in the game though.
So the wording, your way of seeing it would be like grapple would be something that would be played more as a cancellation and not as a strike itself. The one thing I want to try to stray away from, though, is you've used this word additional strikes a couple of times, and I think that because of the complexity of how additional strikes already work in the game, we don't want to make an additional strike thing, because what that does is creates, like, for example, let's go back to your example from Carrion Crows. If Carrion Crows is a strike by itself and it gives an additional strike, that means that it's not in the same strike timing as the other thing, and we have to create a more advanced timing window for that situation. Do you get what I mean there? Okay, so go ahead.
Because for me, like, additional strikes, something which is, yeah, I do get some decks rely on that, but I don't get why you would need it in the first place. Like, combat is not a small step. take it relation to your whole phases. A tiny thing can get quite big for like wall decks, like playing. You have to, for every block, you have to go through like 7 steps, check are there any additional strikes? Do you have strikes which are not counting it? So this is again, it's the question, is there really something to gain out of complexity, or elaborate?
Okay, so I'm glad you're kind of going here, because when we first started pre-talking about this conversation, I was a little worried that we would be too similar in ideas here. But there are aspects of this that I am going to end up arguing you on. So kudos for finding them. I think the additional strike system is honestly good. I think that as far as additional strikes are, it's a nice thing to have in the system if it matters, right? We right now, I think, have a system that it doesn't matter, right? But I don't want to get into this topic at the moment. But I think that like strike combat ends is really damning to so many combat decks in so many ways that unfortunately, like, I think strike combat end, or I think that additional strikes are tangentially pretty worthless. But when we get into like the idea of if we take combat ends out of the equation, I think additional strikes are a really cool concept, and I like the idea of them being something that's afforded to your attacks being quicker than somebody else's, so you can like punch 2 times in the same person that one person can only punch once, or you have a way to get around a dodge with that additional strike option. I think that one of the things, though, that I don't want to end up in is a situation where like cards add more complexity by trying to remove complexity. So in the case of like the grapple scenario, if grapple were to be a thing that like is a strike that basically cancels somebody else's strike and forces them to do a hand strike and gives you an additional strike, I think that makes you have the additional ability to counter somebody else's second thing. So not only would you be able to like counter a gun, but if the other person had an additional strike on top of it, you're basically giving them another way to be able to combat you back. Or if they change their strike into a hand strike that would knock you out, you're in a situation where now your hand strike doesn't resolve, but their hand strike does. So you've actually depowered Immortal Grapple in some ways, which is where having Immortal Grapple be in that pre-strike window does actually work. And this is why I think I like the idea better of if Grapple were a cancel card for a non-hand strike, it would be maybe as useful, if not more useful in that particular sense. But I also think that it's a much different card to be played at that point. And I think that cards get more complicated the more there has to be this back and forth of counterspelling, right? I don't like counterspelling in Magic, and not because I think that counterspells are too strong. I think it's unintuitive gameplay in the same way that I think for 5th edition D&D, counterspells have basically become the meta. You basically need to have 2 casters in most parties that have access to counterspelling, or 2 subcasters that have access to it, because it's going to be that important to just stop a spell. And I don't like the idea of that having to be a mandate in VTES to some degree, which is why... Go ahead.
I was going to get to a different point here.
Okay.
My point is, like, I feel like substantial combat is taking a huge part of the game. If you get in combat and you have, like, I don't know, 10 throws, 8 combats.
Right, if we both had...
Which quite a tiny bit, like, takes a lot of tempo from just people of just playing. Do you have an additional strike? An impressive? Do you have, I don't know, psyche to start a combat?
Right. I think that's a very valid point. Like, you're kind of going to one of the arguments I've heard from people is like the chess timer thing, right? Like, if we were to start, the game is 2.5 hours if you're 5 players. If you started a chess timer, anyone playing a wall deck would be out of the game within the first 45 minutes of the game. I guess maybe not the first 45 minutes, but if you figure that like each player starting the game is probably going to take 15 minutes or like 5 minutes apiece for setup, the wall player is going to be out exponentially faster than the player who's not playing, because they're going to have to deal with combat, they're going to have to deal with the blocking mechanics, they're going to have to deal with like their own internal put a counter on smiling bad card, or like constant don't play this card because it'll get you killed. Like, these are the kind of things that like is going to eat away at the wall player's turn, and ultimately eat away from everybody else's if we're not doing a chess timer, which we're not doing. We're just watching other players lose their time to be able to oust somebody to this player that's eating all of the time in doing the thing that ultimately doesn't result in a lot of game wins anyway, right? That's your point? Okay.
You want to be 5 people.
Yeah, I definitely do get that. I think that is one of the points that I've heard. I've not heard it said, I think, is eloquently, as I think some of what you said there is. I do feel like in this game, combat can really drag out, and especially in decks that like really need to take you out, right? That like they spend 20 cards from their hand in one combat trying to take out one vampire. My argument here, though, is I think this is less of a side effect of the rules and more of a side effect of combat being broken. I think that combat doesn't do what combat is supposed to do, and I think that a lot of people have the wrong strategy about how to win with combat.
Maybe I can follow you the whole complexity of your argument. I feel like complexity or the elaborateness, my friend said, from combat, like the many steps are just make easier because a lot of steps, like a lot of cards being played and making rather able for, I don't know if it's broken, but yeah, just being hard to grasp and taking part of the game.
Yeah. I agree with the idea that it is like a very big time consumer. It's easily one of the biggest time consuming in the game, and oftentimes for very minimal benefit. So I will say it's very elaborate, and I do think that the room for complexity, the room for that elaborate area does makes it more likely that people are going to want to move in that direction. And while I want to see combat be like a viable medium for the game, I think that right now it's very unhealthy that the game does require you to play like 6 or 7 different cards in a round to be really viable. Or if you're really lucky, you can get it down to like maybe 3 cards, but also have that entire strategy like scrapped by something else. And I think if you can get it down to 3 cards, then maybe the whole of combat should only need to be 3 steps. If it can be 3 cards, it can be 3 steps. So I'm very much so with you on the idea of combat takes a lot of time, and that it adds an elaborateness that doesn't sort of need to be there. I think that the point about changing grapple is relevant for a lot of reasons. I mean, the first being grapple, there's literally a step that has to be created to play grapple in like 2 or 3 other cards, and that just really breaks people when you try to explain it to them. Like, well, when do I play this? I don't play this anytime before strikes. I play it in the specific before strikes window, and I feel like there's a lot of cards that like try to stack a lot of this stuff as well, like Carrion Crows being a good example. You just end up with this stack of like, I've played 10 cards before you've even figured out what the range in the combat is going to be. So yeah, I think that overall it's a good like thing to think about. What do we actually want from combat? And if we want the game to be all about combat, should we gear the game? Do we gear the game more towards combat? Do we gear the game less towards combat? Because most of the rest of the game doesn't take this long. I think the longest political action maybe still takes half as long as like a combat deck's average time in combat. Because you can argue that like, oh, players have to argue about who's voting for what and why, but more people are active during that, right? It's all the players at the table discussing like, oh, I don't want that 1 point of damage. Can you soak that 1 point of damage? And later on, I'll give you this for this, right? That adds to the social mechanic. But you're absolutely right. Like, as it stands right now, no other players can do much in combat. There's like, I think 3 cards that an external player could play to impede in somebody else's combat. One of them, you have to share a clan with a vampire that's in the combat to do anything. So I think it's not good mechanically to have a whole subset of the game that only affects like certain players more predominantly, eats a bulk of the game time, and is something that a newer player, somebody who like is just learning the game, is just going to be exhausted by, with like, how many cards are there that could do different things, and how do all these cards layer, and how does aggravated damage work, and etc. Go on.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I feel like when I was teaching, even though I still haven't learned myself, but I just said, okay, we're in combat. You can forget about all the stuff because I know which cards are in your deck, and you don't have any. It doesn't matter to you. And I do have, and I have maybe Carrion Crows, and you have Swallowed by the Night? No, okay. No, combat. So, yeah. And I have this and that, and yeah. So that unsatisfied, but I could. They were playing the last stealth deck 25, which was good because they got like the whole. But I could in combat because this deck.
Yeah. Yep. And once that deck has to encounter what a real combat deck can do, once they really have to play against that, it's like you spent 20 minutes on your turn, and I spent 3. And I did more in my 3 than you did in your 20 minutes, because I happen to have combat ends, and, well, you lose, like, you didn't have grapple, too bad, you played animalism, gotcha. It definitely, it feels like the saddest thing in the game, right? Like, you build a combat deck, and you don't see a grapple, or you don't see, like, the Blood Sorcery Rush card, or you don't happen to get your dog pack, and your opponent's just like, I don't care about the 10 cards you played. I'm out of here. Goodbye. Like, at least mechanically, it abbreviates the time required to do that combat, but at the same time, all you've done is ruined a person's day. And if I think that's going into that, actually, that's another part of, like, what bothers me a lot about the combat ends concept, is that it's one card to beat, like, 1/10 or 1/9 of, like, an entire deck. I play this one card, and too bad for your whole strategy. Your rush card, your stealth card to get into the rush, your damage card, your stop me from, like, doing damage back to you card, and you walk away from this with 0. And even in the best case scenarios, like, maybe you get some blood back because you tasted it, but you can just end up with, like, nope, you did nothing. Like, you walked away with nothing. I'm still standing. I'm still going to do the thing that I'm going to do. And for the rest of the table, they're all looking at you like, you just ate my timer, right? I think a lot of people don't say this, but I think a lot of people, like, need to start thinking about it if they're not already thinking about it. Every time you play against a wall deck, they are basically there to eat the timer. They are going to be there to go to the draw. And this conversation actually happened on the Discord recently, which is another reason I think this is a good topic to discuss. Like, you can just lose infinite time to a wall deck between intercept, between combat, between post-combat stuff. And people will, like, complain when a vote goes for 30 seconds. But when combat's going on for, like, the 3rd or 4th minute, people are just, like, perfectly fine with it because it's what, the deck strategy? The vote is a vote deck strategy. Like, why do you have a problem here? Let's talk about, like, the real elephant in the room, which is combat what we want combat to be? Is this the way we envision combat? Shouldn't it just be simpler? Shouldn't, like, doing the damage, playing the cards, be a lot more straightforward?
I think combat ends are not issues. The issue is...
Agreed. Well, sort of.
The issue is, as far as I can recall, you can't get a game with the combat combat only dedicated. So...
well, you can. It just requires you to. It requires you to, like, do a lot of. You have to, like, let the table wind itself down and then try to pick off the right players at the right time. It becomes this whole, like, gradual timing based game. And if you lose on 1 or 2 combats, well, then now you definitely don't have a chance at the table. It's very selective.
Yeah, but let's say a corner case.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
And if there is a corner case,
it's not proof of success, right? It doesn't prove that. Yeah. Combat is a real strategy. Yeah.
So even maybe I'm not making myself popular here, but nevertheless, I think if you just take away, like, all additional strikes, all grapple, all this stuff in the 5 already, and have 3 steps, like you said, then strike combat ends wouldn't be so bad.
Mm-hmm.
Because you played maybe Kevin Gross, you played whichever, and then we played Roundhouse, and then I said, okay, try combat ends. But it wouldn't hurt as much because it's a strategy. It couldn't be. You would have to focus on something else, like you're keeping sabotage alive.
Well, here's a thing that for a long time has been confusing to me, right? What is long range, right? If you go to long range, why is there a press? How do you press? If you can't run back up to the person that ran away from you, suddenly you can because you press? I think that the idea of how we structure maneuvers is weird, and I think the press concept should be much more rare. I think a press is something that you should gain from something very deliberate, and I think it should be less difficult for a deck to get it when it needs it, right? But it should be one of those things that, like, it's played on its own. So as an example, right? I think that if we go with the grapple idea, that instead of Immortal Grapple being what it is now, we create a new card that's called like Heavy Grapple. Okay, it's a card that allows you to strike for a certain amount of damage and cancel an opponent, or the opponent's combat ends cards are either canceled or cannot be played. And then if it's successful, you can then get the special option to press. But I don't think that it necessarily makes sense to have press exist as an extra step, because it enforces this idea of I didn't get them in the first round, so let's do a whole nother round of the same thing all over again. This is what I was talking about earlier, and I think you were alluding to it as well, we just said it in different ways. Like, it opens the door up for people to just feel like this is a playable thing, to just keep throwing cards at the solution until it ends. Whereas we're not inventing better ways to solve the problem. Like, there should be smarter ways to solve grapple, not more complex and convoluted ways to solve grapple, like Psych. Psych shouldn't be a thing that people think is a solution to grapple. It kind of just shouldn't exist, right? There should be a better way to stop grapple, or to just cancel grapple. Or not grapple, I mean combat ends.
And again, I think the problem is, like, if you took it correctly, you would have to create an 8th step. Like the after presses, wait for time key, like that.
Well, so they consider that technically the 7th step, right? Because that's the end of round step is when you would play.
No, but it's start a new combat instead.
Well, no. It's now start a new round, right? Because I think that, remember, this got errated. The current printing for Psych says to start a new round of combat.
Tracking remains, right?
I think it's done the same way. I think when they reworded one, they reworded the other. I'm checking this real quick. Yeah, it's now start a new round. So it's basically a press without a press. It's very annoyingly worded and doesn't need to exist in the way that it is.
Okay, so I'm taking back what.
Yeah, it's fine. The gist of what you're saying though is still relevant, in that the card doesn't need to be what the card is. If we want a better way to like counter a combat ends card, and the idea like with telepathic tracking is you're still within the same window of time equivalent to a press, and you just like know that the combat ends is going to happen, so you pretend it is and you wait for them to walk away and then you chase after them. Or like you come out of the combat ends and you realize like, no, I gotta go get that person. You still have all your crows following you around. Like, why would this not instead be something that's like just cancel combat ends as it is played, right? Why not make it something as simple as that? Or make it a strike that you have that is a strike and cancel combat ends that was played or whatever, and no others can be played. Just make more cards along these sort of lines that are more simple and don't lead to combats that need to have this laundry list of cards played that takes a bunch of time from everybody playing the game and may not necessarily result in literally anything that happens. Because even a bleed results in something happening. Even a failed bleed results in some sort of like occurrence happening. But it's so frequent that combat basically feels like it does functionally nothing at the absolute worst case. And I feel like that's a very sad feeling for most players to experience.
Yeah, and I remember playing against a combat deck not too long ago, not in our youth, but nevertheless, he was so afraid of my mounts that he rushed all the way backwards. And essentially, he lost the game because of it.
Yep.
Like, if you don't have any strategy to cope with leads, like, other than rushing backwards, are you sure your deck is doing what it's supposed to be, like, going to your left?
Well, and there's the other end, there's the opposite of that coin, too. Like, the deck, if let's say the deck succeeded instead, right? You didn't draw the right number of combat ends, now you're not playing V-Test. And that person is, like, out of cards because they used all their gas on you.
I couldn't play Vita because I got torporized all the time.
Yep.
And because of that, he didn't go onto his grave, and because of this, he lost.
Gotcha. I thought maybe he lost to you because he just was unsuccessfully able to beat your combat ends. It's just... So yeah, I think combat ends needs a change, and it sounds like we're kind of in agreement on this, or not combat ends, just combat in general needs a change and needs to be, I would agree, needs to be simplified. I think that as it stands right now, combat creates this sort of red herring in the game. And I love the mechanical potential for combat in this, but I feel like combat in this game is almost its own game in and of itself. And for a while, I've been thinking about introducing a conceptual format I have for this game that is combat focused, because there's so many cool combat cards, and I understand why people really want to play them. But this is a very long game. It's a game that does require 5 players to play, and there's not a real way to hasten it up if combat has to happen the way that it does. Combat should be something that's quick and easy and resolved. It's like almost a two strangers passing the night. My vampire's on their way, as we used to say back in the day, my vampire's on its way to blow up your McDonald's, and like the other guy's vampire runs out, and like I see him coming, so I quickly duck into the shadow, but his like eyes light up and can see exactly where I'm at, and he starts running towards me, and then I make like some shadows come up around me, and they're like thicker shadows that get around his eyes, and like, oh, he knew in his mind ahead of time that this was going to happen. So he's like already at the point where I'm going to go. And it's that like back and forth that's kind of fun about the game. But then you add this whole like, now we're going to stand out and have a street fight in the middle of the road that's going to take multiple minutes of time to do, where guns are being fired like left and right, and like we're using all of our crazy powerful vampire shit. Like, sorry, but no, this is masquerade endangerment 100%. You don't have multi-round fights in the street. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the V5 core rulebook literally says like combat should be no more than 3 rounds. It should be very simple, very straightforward, because it's a storytelling element that's just supposed to be a taste of it. And you as vampires shouldn't be like showing off all your powers in the range where people can see them. And so if you're supposed to be just encountering people in the night, it should be, I run up, I smash into them with my fist, and I keep moving. Or I pull out my 44 and I start pulling back as fast as I can while I let a shot go, right? And the vampire doesn't chase after you because, well, shit. Like, there could be anybody walking down the street at any point. And if we're both seeing doing what we're doing, well, we got the princes that are going to show up and make sure our asses are burned in the night. So maybe we don't do this. But the game doesn't work that way. The game allows this kind of like weird non-narrative option to happen that would not make sense if we were to try to turn that into the RPG concept.
I think it's a nice term you took there. When we were talking about Fall of London, it's like maybe being closer on the RPG element is something referred to right now in a completely different way. And I think there could be something to gain, like we actually do have, like, what you described by something being shadowed and the other one saying, this is what stealth and intercept is.
Correct.
And then you just, like, found you, and now I grab my hammer and have a concealed weapon. It costs me 4 points.
But it's a gun I already own. How did that work? I don't, like, to me, so I can very easily separate these ideas of substance and flavor. As somebody who enjoys cooking, I think it's a very important thing to know goes outside of just cooking. When you're playing a card game, when you're developing a game, having that extra like substance to provide flavor and not just adding flavor for the purposes of adding flavor is important. It's the difference between like why it is that people can be satisfied with fake meat and why people like still end up eating regular meat, like why it's not going to do it. There is something extra in substance that exists in regular meat that for many people is very difficult to leave. And it's because there is a hole in that taste. And to me, part of combat isn't filling that hole. It's not, it seems like with all this stuff, it should be filling the hole, but it doesn't. It actually, in my opinion, is counterintuitive to flavor. And what is more intuitive to flavor is keeping that natural flow of the game moving. Things being quick and simple, and there being a bit of an imbalance, but not too much of an imbalance, just to keep the game running strong. Yeah. But there are other ways that flavor can be bad. You can sometimes just, I don't know, add paprika to, I don't have a good reference, never mind. But you can like add too much flavor, add the wrong flavoring to something, and then you end up with Fall of London. You end up with like, you know, these cards that unfortunately don't have a great impact on the game. Sure, Operation Antigen is like a cool conceptual idea, but concepts they're not meaningful. They have no substance. You need to have substance in those things to add to them. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I feel like, Fall of London, not the right reference, but here. But as I said, I think combat, the way it is, not creating enough flavor for the whole table, like immersion.
Yeah.
And if this is not the case, maybe shorten it.
Yeah. It's definitely something that I think is worth them having a real conversation about. I think that there is a lot of resistance to this because the idea of combat is something that players really don't want to lose. And the feeling they've had about combat for years is a really nice feeling. I personally feel like, and I hear it from other players and heard it in the myriad of times I've tried teaching this game to players. Again, I've had a lot of time running a game store and have had a lot of time before and after that still teaching this game to people, and the same thing ends up happening. Combat's a really cool mechanic until you have to engage with it for a little while, and then it's just a lot to deal with and a lot to like manage, and like, oh, why doesn't this actually result in a win? There's all these cool cards that bait me into thinking like, oh, this is going to be a solid and reliable deck, and at the end of the day they're like, well, I did the thing I wanted to do, but I still walked away not feeling like I did anything. What was the point in this? And combat doesn't need to be that. I do feel like it's lost. Like there's all this unnecessary additive that doesn't benefit anyone. And that really kind of makes me disappointed. I do love this game. This is not me. I know I've come off in a couple of these as sounding like very critical of the game itself, but I'm playing this game and I'm not playing this game because I hate it or because I'm some kind of masochist. Like, I'm playing this game because there's a lot of beauty in the game. What I talked about in the stealth versus intercept is wonderful. I love the conceptual idea of contesting. I love the idea of what a master is in principle, right? These are really great things that really do make you feel like you are a Methuselah having an impact on the world, trying to get your minions to do what they want to. And when you can't draw a celerity card, it's the idea that like that minion isn't listening to you, right? You're like trying to send him your mental mind waves to like get him to do the thing. And he's just like, I'm not getting any stealth right now. Fuck that. I don't know what this voice in my head is, but it can go fuck itself. Right? That's why you didn't draw the celerity card, because unfortunately Theo was just not interested in using celerity that day. That was not me trying to black voice, by the way. I just want to make this clear, because I realized I used Theo in that example and then made a voice that sounded kind of gruff. But that was just my gruff voice. That was not like me trying to not intimidate. That was not me trying to imitate Theo Bell, for the record. I don't need to be canceled over something like that. But I think that, like, these things really are the things that make the game really fun. And the idea of what combat could be is something that a lot of people get dragged into. And they all really want to do it. But when you get involved in what combat actually is, it is so much work. It is so much time. There is such an easy way to be thwarted that you just end up like either disappointed or in denial.
Yeah, and I had two things coming to my mind while you were talking. For one, I think people who are into combat are into combat as long as they are playing it. Mm-hmm. If they're playing a different deck, it would feel completely not as enjoyable.
But then they blame it on I don't have combat.
Yeah, sure. This is called Stockholm Syndrome.
Oh, man. All the combat players are going to be so mad at us if they're listening to this episode, if they've even gotten this far. I'm so sorry, guys, but you might want to talk to somebody about your combat issues.
The point I wanted to make is combat feels good as long as you're the mighty playing all these cards. And if you're the one sitting at the other end of the table, not as prey from the combat, just like watching what the others are doing, it's not so fun anymore.
Please know that this is not us saying that we think combat is stupid and combat shouldn't exist in the game. This is us saying we want combat to be better, and we want combat decks to have the ability to be more successful without dampening or hampering the game for the rest of players playing it. You should feel like when you play a combat deck, you've done something effective, you've had an impact on the game, and the rest of the players should feel like we didn't have to spend a portion of our time waiting for this to finally be over and either end with one player being completely blown out of the experience or the other player being completely blown out of the experience, or neither player really suffering any tangible like losses.
One thing to add to this, the second idea is why it wouldn't hurt, I think, if combat card, like from potent, would be stronger in total.
Mm-hmm.
Roundhouse is 3 damage?
Yeah.
Why not making it 4? Or making maybe even 5? So you would need an additional strike to make that make some sustainable. Just
well, to me,
damage.
three theoretically would be relevant damage, right? It's enough to like thwomp any low cap vampire. It's enough to impact the vampire's need to keep bleeding you. I think the bigger problem is that to get that benefit of the 3 damage, you need X other cards to get to the point of playing that. You have to outmaneuver the other person. You have to out grapple the other person. And then you have to still even connect with it at the end of the day. And this is actually, to me, the problem. Roundhouse is built around this idea of you've played other cards that stop a person from doing something, so you can't make Roundhouse a 5 damage card, because if you're successful from the other 2 cards, 5 damage is then too much damage. So you're stuck with 3 damage, but then 3 damage just feels disappointing if you... It does feel disappointing if you put in that investment, and that's all you end up getting from it. I think that if we simplify it down and it's much harder to either end combat or dodge or like there's some better mechanism for this, you can make a 3 damage thing or a high risk 5 damage card where like you could combat ends it, but if I get it, it's going to be great, right?
Yeah, exactly. I feel like you were pointing out earlier that maybe you play 5, 6, 7, 8 cards to get where you want to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you could just like lose or 3 of them if you make a 5 damage or whichever, because then it's 1 card, and if this is strike competent, it doesn't hurt so much.
Right.
Because you didn't have to play quickness. Okay, quickness is not a good enough stuff for reference at this point, but still, you wouldn't have needed to play a lot of cards to ensure that your hits connect, because you have enough of the others. And let's see, the other has so many combatants that he can really outdo you over the whole course of the...
Well, okay, so let's look at it like this, because I don't want Celerity to lose the concept of additional strikes. But let's think about let's compare it to Bleed, right? Let's compare combat to Bleed. We have a stealth intercept mechanic in Bleed that we would want to keep. So you keep the kind of maneuvers concept in there. That is your stealth intercept mechanic. When we go into the strike step, we have this sort of cards can be canceled or cards can be adjusted. So let's say that I have the new grapple, the heavy grapple, where I cancel your combat card. Right? Maybe that doesn't strike for anything. Maybe that just strikes for 1 damage. Or maybe it strikes for 2, or I don't know. That can be mathed out. Celerity, instead of becoming a damage and an additional strike thing, becomes something you do after somebody plays prevent cards. So let's say somebody plays Skin of Steel to prevent all damage. Then, like in a Bleed, you play this Celerity card is additional damage on top of that allows you to still deal damage on top of it. So it becomes more of an action modifier as opposed to you need to play both the quickness and then another strike card in order to do enough damage, or have played Torn Signpost earlier in the round to deal the extra damage along with the Immortal Grapple. Then we've kind of negated the things that we want to negate. We've gotten around we've got a way to get around that combat end step. We've got a way to create more of the mechanics that already exist in the game without adding a different layer of mechanics that people have to learn that are different from the game itself. Conceptually, I think that could work. Mechanically, I don't know. Obviously, it would need to be. It's a playtester's nightmare to try to have to play through an entirely different game. But at the end of the day, the thing that I think I want people to come out of this most is this is a thing that can be changed over time. This is a thing that if we simplify the game and make cards that sound better, we can eliminate the need for the more complicated cards and just sort of make them disappear and end up with a game that feels more like the rest, a sub-game that feels more like the rest of the game instead of the sub-game that feels like a completely different game in and of itself.
Something, as you know, V5 is the same topic. For example, First Strike.
Does nothing.
I would be glad if First Strike wouldn't appear in V5 because it is a mechanic which adds more complexity. Like, as you said, reducing complexity, maybe in cards would act what we already have instead of making or reducing a strike card different in its whole way. Like, it's not as resolves first, but after strike combat end.
I think I think the wording and the timing of or the wording stuff and the like how to do this stuff it's a bit hard to come up with, but I think we've kind of hit the general idea here, and that is that overall, like, combat could be restructured in a way to make it feel better and flow with the game. And as it stands right now, combat isn't quite the flow that we want for the game, and it should be more rational. It should be more simple. I feel like a lot of aspects of the rest of this game are very easy to explain to somebody. Bleeding is really easy to explain. Intercept versus stealth is really easy to explain. The fact that there will be a combat is easy to explain. Influencing maybe is difficult because of the word transfer but it's still easy enough to ultimately explain. How non-out-of-turn masters work is easy enough to explain. I think these things work really well, and combat just doesn't feel that way. It's like, okay, now we need to talk about this second game, and I don't really want the game to be that way, because I do feel the same way about, like, some of the master out-of-turn stuff. When do you play it? How do you play it? What is the timing like on this? How does it actually work? What happens to my master later? What happens if the master out of turn has a trifle attached to it? What happens to the card that's there when it's interacted with? I feel like we don't do enough to actively talk about, like, that weird interplay between card functionality and the rest of the system. That's a really hard one to explain.
Yeah, and for example, trifle is something before we started talking on the record. I think it is something to learn, like you play first the trifle, then the normal master. But is it really something so necessary to just make this the order? Why can't you? What would be the problem if you could play a trifle after you play the usual master?
Yeah, I don't. So I think mechanically it would make sense, right? If the idea behind a trifle is it's such a minuscule action that I can do it while still doing the main thing that I'm doing, right? Like a free action in an RPG. Why is it that I can't, during my master phase, play one trifle, regardless of whether or not I've played a master before that? I do agree with you that, like, trifle shouldn't necessarily have to be the first thing that you do during the actions. I think that's part of how those cards are supposed to be balanced. I don't think it's necessarily beneficial.
And it would help something which for essential is card flow.
Yeah. Card flow is very hard in this game just in general. The way that, going back to, like, the combat concept, when we play combat cards, a lot of people play them a certain way, and I don't know, I've brought this up before, and I've had, like, people argue with me that no judge would ever rule against this, but I want to make it clear. The way the game rules are right now, when you play a card, you're supposed to put it immediately in your discard pile. It doesn't get put into play while all the players like look at it and think about what to do with it. It doesn't do what Magic does and go on to some sort of stack. Now, there is a limbo moment where the card is in your discard pile, but its effect is pending, but it's actually in your discard pile, and you can cancel the effect of it, but the card is actually not there, it's somewhere else. This when I first found out exactly how, like, the current wording is for, like, direct intervention, and then I had an argument with a guy on the I think a guy, I shouldn't genderize, with someone on the Discord about it, and then discovered that, like, we were both kind of right and we were both kind of wrong. I was even more frustrated by the very conceptual idea of how cards are played. And this is one that I'm forcibly transitioning us to this topic, or, like, tried to stealth transition us to, but now I'm going to be very obvious about it, that I really want to change. Cards should be played to the table, and until they are finished in their action, they should be on the table, visible for people to play. So if I play Govern the Unaligned at Superior, right, I lock my vampire, declare that they are performing Govern the Unaligned at Superior. Then we start the window for someone can play a direct intervention. If somebody chooses to, great, my Govern the Unaligned is canceled. Then I get the option to play a Seduction immediately upon there. Nobody says anything about blocking. I don't draw back up until we've passed that direct intervention window. Then I can play my Seduction in the same window, and then we wait for one more direct intervention, and then I draw back up. If it's canceled, the Govern the Unaligned gets removed from the table and put in the discard pile. The reason that stuff like this makes sense is all the things are always visible, and this is how we mechanically are teaching it to players. I have never seen a prince teach somebody the game as you put the card, you declare the card and put it in your discard pile. You don't see it in Lackey. You don't see it in Paper. You don't see it anywhere. And if I were like one of the worst kind of Magic players, the very first thing I would do when I play this game is I would put literally every card I play in the discard pile. Because it's the best way to confuse another player as to what's going on. How much stealth is now on the action? Well, shit. You played 1, 2. Can I look at your discard pile? Wait, did you play this on this turn? Did you play an Elder Impersonation? Did you play it at Lesser or Superior? Oh, it was Superior? Oh, that I'm actually not blocking. Like, you've just created this instance where it can get confusing. And I understand that, like, the argument stands as, like, well, no judge is going to rule on this. But the problem is, like, if a judge isn't ruling, the player that's playing the game properly is playing the game properly and the rest of the players aren't, then the judge is not doing his job, which is rules enforcement. Rules enforcement is Judge Rule 1. You enforce the rules of the game, right? Like, you don't, it's just not something that you want to have. Your game should reflect the way the players want to play it. Even Magic the Gathering understood this at some point. They seem to have forgone that as of late, but they really understood it when they changed how interrupts work and moved just to instants. When they recognized that the way that the combat worked was convoluted, complicated, and had extra steps that didn't need to exist. The way that damage stacking existed and shouldn't have worked. Like, they really streamlined the game, and it improved the game for so many players that wanted to play the game and didn't like being cheated out of these things. And the easiest way to do that was to make things clear and concise. When you play cards in Magic, you play them to the stack. Players see what the cards are. When they're finished, they go in your discard pile. This game could do the exact same thing in combat. The cards get layered out. If I play a card that cancels something, you just remove it from the cards on the table, put it in the ash heap. Problem solved. When the action is over, all the cards that were played during that action time window get scooped up, put in the ash heap. Just that simple. Why do the rules not reflect what the game wants you to do? I know there was a very large rant.
I think the point, how do people learn the game? Again, this is where I come from, what I still am coming from. This is a really valid point, because I feel like this is for any other complex card game. But the more you need to memorize, if by rules per se, like how many intercept has been played, how many stealth has been played, how much blood govern the inner line cost, or whichever card, when it's not so. And govern the inner line costs, if it is successful, like after resolution of the action.
There's also that weird thing, right, where you can succeed and fail at an action, where like you get enough stealth, but you've used your blood, and now you can't pay for govern the unaligned. So while you weren't blocked, you also didn't actually govern the unaligned, and so that card goes in your ash heap, but nothing.
You would need to. You would need to look up how much you have to pay for govern the unaligned.
Right. Fish out the card, be like, oh yeah, it was 1, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is, I think, again, the game is complex and elaborate.
Yep.
And I think this is something where you could reduce the elaborateness without reducing complexity.
Yeah. Imagine if when you declared an action, you had to take the blood off your vampire and put it on that card. Now you know both govern will be paid for, and if it's canceled, you get the blood back. You don't lose it. You can put the blood back on your vampire. But you've already committed to the action. You've already, like, said this is what you're going to do. So if it's successful, you should be able to succeed at it. But you shouldn't be able to allocate resources that you no longer have, or that you basically pending don't have. It to me is a nonsensical thing to try to explain to a new player who's left the blood on their vampire and then gets to a point where, like, they've Elder Impersonation, and then they're like, well, now what happens with the card? And you have to explain it like, well, you don't go to Torpor, the card just does nothing. Well, I get to unlock, right, because I didn't do anything. No, you did something. You just evaded being stopped from doing something. And it's like, but then I should have been able to do my thing. And it's like, no, because you spent too much money. Like, it's such a weird thing to explain. You can explain it. You can definitely explain it. It's like if you go to the grocery store and you see that they have one of those like slot machines at it, or those like gambling machines at it, and you sit down and you spend your money on the gambling, but you manage to get up and walk away from the gambling machine, but you realize that like you just spent all the money on the gambling. So even though you're at the grocery store, you can't buy the food anymore, and now you have to like leave the grocery store as a sad person. Conceptually, that's how that works. But I don't want to have to explain this in the middle of a game, that there's this whole sub-mechanic they just missed is a possibility that could happen. It would just make more sense, again, if we could just, like you said, take the elaborateness away from it. And in doing so, like, we're not taking away the potential for a complicated card or a complex card game. We're just taking away these, like, fringe things that can happen that just mechanically do not fit the game in any way that's rational, and any way that's conducive to more players and new players being able to play.
And you wouldn't need to explain what limbo is.
Because there's not a lot of situations that create the limbo situation. There are only a handful, but they happen often enough, and you have to try to explain it. Like a card that's sitting there waiting to be like that weird scenario where like you have the seduction and you can't, and the govern is there, but you're waiting for the DI, but you have to have the seduction there, but also not there because you're supposed to play it at the same time, but can't technically play it at the same time because the way the rules are written. Oh! It makes me so frustrated when I'm trying to talk about this with people. And like, there's so many times where this happens. And god damn it, I love this game. I hate sometimes trying to teach it past a certain level. If you can teach it at like a base level, like when I was teaching my girlfriend how to play this and I gave her my Kia Seed Gremlins Bleed deck. And I made sure I was like not playing cards that had more complicated things in it, because I didn't want her to have to experience like all the worst parts of this game. I wanted her to know that like these are cool things that can happen, but they're not like, but I don't want her to like have to get into the nitty gritty of like all the shitty parts of combat or all the shitty parts of like a lot of other things. And it's sad that it takes that much once a player gets past like their third or fourth game to try to keep their interest in the game, because now the game has gotten so much more complicated and so much more elaborate without providing without providing more depth to the game and real room for somebody to move. And I know I'm going to get like shot in the comments for that comment, but I also think that if you really process it in the long term, you'll realize it's kind of true. A lot of the cards that we think are really cool and really complicated and really unique are also cards that are kind of complicated and push people away and limit the number of games of V-Test that we can play. And if you've seen a lot of the same faces for too long playing the game and notice that faces disappear over time from the game and just don't come back, maybe this is a big part of it. And we don't want to like think about that as being a possibility.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, like my push continues to be, I think that this game can still be a great game and still is a great game. If the game didn't change, if the game doesn't change, I'm going to continue to play V-Test. But I think that this game could change, and I think it would only improve the game literally for everybody. And the ways that I'm suggesting are ways I think would benefit the players, I mean, just the community in general and the game itself. I know that there is a lot of people that would say otherwise, and I know that I basically could tell you exactly who the people are going to be. But at the end of it, like, do you want a game that more people want to play, or do you want a game that you play by yourself and you're like talking to people in a closed community that have no new insight or information to bring?
Yeah, I think in general, the balance, opening up, staying conservative, is good. It is a hard balance to find, and not trying to open up is no option, because then it just stagnates, and then the games from 95, like people who played it from day one, just get old sometime.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be really bad or really sad, because it is really unique and it deserves to be accessible to players.
Yeah. I feel like this game plays so much differently than a lot of the card games I played. I feel like it is very representative of the RPG that it is, derived from. I think it is a brilliant, brilliant game that just was clearly written by Richard Garfield during his early days. It is a game that has been adamantly and thankfully supported heavily by its players, by the community, by the people who volunteered in the game initially. But I think it's starting to show some signs of that. And I really appreciate the things that were done to V5 to help try to streamline. And I really appreciate the feedback and the opposition of people that say, like, we don't want this to change, or here's why we don't want this to change. I think that it's just as important that people argue and have their opinions, because I don't think that, like, our idea on combat is 100% the right direction, but I definitely don't think we get to the right direction by disregarding our position on it. I don't think that we get to the end of it by disregarding the opposed position on it. I think we get to the best position for the game by listening to what the community itself has. And I appreciate the people that are outspoken, even if it might seem like at times in Discord or in the comment section of this, I vehemently argue with. Because I think that it's important to discuss these things. I feel like it's important to find a neutral ground, find a position where the game is what we all want it to be overall. And we maximize the number of people that want to play it, so we can all have more unique and interesting games, and not just watch every finals have Emerald Legionnaires and Girls Will Find in it, with the occasional combat deck that thinks it's going to somehow win and then still ends up like barely getting a half a VP at the end. I want the game to be better. I want the game to be more what it wants and what we want it to. Yeah, I think with that, I'm gonna end.
Last follow-up, if you have anything to add.
Yep, always helpful. Glad to argue them at all costs. Good night, everyone. Thanks so much.